Hello, and thanks for tuning in to Plentiful, an Abound Food Care podcast where we take a deeper dive into food care and how we can create a world in which hunger and food waste are eliminated. With your host, Mike Leorakis.
Welcome to the inaugural edition of Plentiful, the Abound Food Care podcast. To give everything we cover some context, I want to tell a real quick story. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to walk through a riverbed in Orange County that had 3,500 homeless people living in it. And as we walked through, we found all these people walking around with plastic trash bags or grocery bags with something really heavy in it. And we asked one gentleman what was in the bag. And he opened it up, and it was an 8-pound turkey breast. And we asked him, what are you going to do with that? And his response was, I don't know, bro. I'm on parole. I can't even have a knife. I don't know how I'm going to eat this. For me, it was a great example of how everybody did the right thing. In other words, a distributor or manufacturer processor donated that turkey breast to a food bank. The food bank sent that turkey breast to a nonprofit agency that feeds hungry people. That agency had to get rid of that product, had to distribute it before it went bad, so they just handed it out to the people who frequent that agency. And still, that product was likely to end up on the floor of a dry riverbed rotting away. So we really failed to get that excess food to people in need. But it highlighted for us that there are an awful lot of gaps and complexities to optimizing the food supply chain, to recovering excess edible food and getting it to people in need. So what we're going to cover in this podcast series are all these complexities and gaps, but not just identify them. We're also going to be able to show the solutions that are available. Some of those solutions include solar-powered cold storage facilities that are in development now. One of them is already in the city of Anaheim. These units can be used out in food deserts, out in areas where there's a lack of resources, and food banks can be able to move that product into those units where nonprofit agencies in that area can pull product. These units can also hold nutritious meals. These meals could be emergency food for the community in case of a disaster. And these could also be basically lockers for food, where excess edible food it can be stored until the next day when it can be moved to a food bank or an operation that can receive it. It buys time. Other solutions include expanding the existing food repurposing kitchen network, where existing facilities take this donated bulk food and convert it. They repurpose it into nutritious meals for the community, for those in need. These meals can also be made around dietary restrictions. So now seniors no longer have to make the choice between going hungry or having emergency non-perishable food loaded with sodium that ultimately exacerbates a medical condition. They can have access to nutritious food. And then finally, technology that will enhance our ability to identify where food is at and get it to nonprofit agencies that feed people. So my name is Mike Leorakis. I am the executive director of Abound Food Care. I'm a 30-plus year food industry lifer. It is our goal to be able to identify for all of you in upcoming podcasts some of the details and nuances of food recovery. But more importantly, in today's podcast, we're going to give you just a glimpse. We're going to touch on 3 areas that kind of make up food recovery and optimizing the food supply chain. First, we're going to talk to somebody from the food industry to give their perspective. We're also going to talk to someone who's a nonprofit agency that recovers food, and hear about how collaboration is really the key to being able to work together and maximize our abilities. And then finally, we're going to hear from a public health officer who can talk about the negative effects of food insecurity and, more importantly, the costs associated with that. So I hope you join us not only today, but for this series. We hope it'll be enlightening. We welcome conversation, debate, but more importantly, collaboration. We're all in this together. This morning, we're very lucky to have with us Brian Allred. Brian is a friend of mine, someone we've known for many, many years. I first met him when he was president of Cisco LA. Brian is currently the COO of RAS, Retail as a
Service.
service. He's also serves on the board of a grocery chain out of Houston. He's a food industry lifer, and he understands all areas of the food industry, which is why we kind of connected early on, and really he understood kind of what we face, what some of those gaps are, because they're much the same gaps that we face in the food industry. But more importantly, Brian understood, that the food industry wants to participate in this. We just need to give them an avenue. So without any further ado, Brian, thank you so much for joining us. We want to start off by asking a real quick question and giving it some context. If 38 to 40% of all food that is produced in the US is ultimately wasted, can you explain to us, and if food is money, then why does the food industry waste so much food?
First of all, thank you, Mike. I appreciate you having me on today. This is a really important topic for me, as I know it is for Abound Food Care, and really for the full life cycle of food as a whole for this country. When you think about the way that food is handled, whether it's in the retail arena or in the food service arena, there really is just a lack of an effective system-wide food donation option in the food industry. When you look at what happens in the retail world, grocery stores that actively go through product on a daily basis, the need to donate food is abundant, especially with lack of having certain products in-house. Even today with supply chain issues, there's products that aren't available to a consumer. And so the full recipe can't be made. The rest of that recipe needs to go into some sort of a system that can be utilized. That happens as well in the food service arena. I've always told the story of 16 pallets of squash, how that gets out into the industry, and can it be put into a system that can utilize that product effectively, which means that people need to know what to do with it. It's not just about getting it to the location, it's about turning it into consumable food at that point. I think there's a couple other things, Mike, that I would say are happening that make it so that food gets wasted. The second is any major brand that has product that puts their name on a product has the concern that if I donate this, how do I know that it'll be handled safely, that it'll stay away from foodborne illnesses and anything that would adversely affect the brand? That something hits the news that says the product, even if I donated it, got somebody sick, would be devastating to a brand, and they want to feel comfortable that we've been able to take care of that through the process. And really, we just have too many gaps in the charitable feeding system, which is really why I'm excited about what Abound Food Care is doing.
Okay, so you touched on something that I want to go into a little deeper. When we ask food industry potential donors, why don't they donate food, or what will it take to donate food? They'll always give one excuse. The first one is liability. I was the same way for 20 years. It was always, it's fear of liability, don't want to get sued, don't want to come back. When in reality, it was always brand protection. So, and if it's brand protection, meaning we can handle a lawsuit, but we can't handle someone getting sick on food that we donated and it being traced back to us. It's just such a hit to all the time and effort and money that we've put into building these brands. It really comes down to food safety, doesn't it? And if so, how, from your base of expertise, how big is that food safety component?
Yeah, Mike, I would say that while I agree that you hear about this brand protection, the brand protection and food safety are not mutually exclusive. Those really do go together. When you think about what's happening in getting the food industry to participate in handling excess food, what happens with that, and how to be able to do that profitably and make sure that you stay inside of time, temperature, danger zones, that once the product leaves my facility, that it gets into the right locations. I think that Abound has accurately identified that the key to getting greater participation in the food industry in handling this excess food is that piece of making that a profitable solution.
Okay, so that's interesting you mentioned that. So let's take a moment, as you've been a supporter of our model of Abound Food Care and our identification of all these gaps in the food supply chain and the food system, both for profit and also in the charitable feeding realm. you've been on the front lines of finding some of those solutions. So I'd like to give you an opportunity, if you don't mind, to identify some of those solutions that you've been passionate about.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a few of these that are probably further along, and others that I'm certainly invested in helping to push further into the norm as far as helping solve for some of these issues. And I have been a huge advocate of getting these into play. The first is a sustainable, probably solar paneled cold storage unit that can act as a hub for a food bank. Today, when food banks receive product, let's say we go back to my example, they receive 3 pallets of squash. To get those products to pantries that could utilize those is very difficult. Oftentimes, pantries are coming in, they have church groups that are helping to feed the homeless, and it's about how do we get this food, get everybody in a room, get everybody fed, and you're feeding hundreds of people at a time, taking that squash and peeling it and boiling it down and cutting it up and adding it to a soup that you need additional ingredients for that are fairly costly is very difficult to do. If we can get these sustainable solar powered units out into food deserts or food apartheids, the opportunity to put some of that squash in there where a single mother who's too far away from a grocery store because her car isn't working can grab that food and make a meal for her family using the other ingredients she has in her home is a great opportunity for us to not only help with these food deserts, but also to make sure this food no longer goes to waste. So I'm excited about that. I know that we've got that tested in several places around the country, and I'm excited to continue to grow that piece of what Abound Food Care is doing. The second is when you think about the way that a lot of the not-for-profits are purchasing product, there's a few places that you would hope that we as an organization or that as a community or a government would not want to charge more for food. Certainly that would be prisons, colleges, but more than anywhere else in feeding people that are in need. And the way that if the donations aren't exact, all of these organizations have to purchase some product. You typically don't get all of the ingredients. Everything doesn't always come together. And so you're asked to go out and purchase, and the ability to do that in a bulk purchasing program has not been set up nationally. So you literally have tens of thousands of pantries that are all trying to buy individually everything from toilet paper to pepper to different beef products or milk. And the way that they're purchasing is like you or I would if we were to buy independently, because we haven't pulled them together and helped them to do that in the private sector. So I think that working directly with distributors and manufacturers to help make that happen is another thing that Abound Food Care is working towards and that I certainly am excited about and support. And then the last one I would talk about is really enhancing logistics coordination. When you think about the way that food is moving around, even inside of a county, inside of a city, and inside of the state, the working with these organizations, bringing them together in a way that says, hey, there's a lot of cost that goes into supply chain. We can help reduce that if we work together is absolutely true. Why not help with both the carbon footprint, the way the food moves around to more adequately meet the needs of the different areas, and doing that all together certainly gives you a much better opportunity. So I think I've given you 3, Mike, that I probably could go on for another 5 minutes about others, but getting a sustainable solar powered cold unit containers out there, doing bulk purchasing, and then working together to enhance logistics coordination between these organizations would make all the difference in the world in solving for these issues.
Well, I appreciate your leadership in this because you've been a huge advocate for it. These are all create cost benefits for these nonprofit agencies that feed people, meaning charitable donations of monetary donations actually go much further when you can reduce their costs. And, I think it's, as you mentioned, an area that we've kind of ignored for decades. But once we can get all these nonprofit agencies working together, economies of scale present an opportunity to enhance what they do. So real quickly, I want to just ask you to share with us, because this is your wheelhouse now, is how do you see distribution evolving, in the next few years?
Well, I'd say that's a very good, very open-ended question, Mike. I think that that our government has realized that there has been some shortages in supply chain, that whether retail or food service, the way in which we reach the public as a whole needs to change. We have to become more regionalized in the way that we support feeding our country. That means that you've got to be producing product more regionally based. It means that you need to have processing facilities for cattle and chicken and all of the different proteins that are out there. You got to have those more regionalized. That when produce, which can only be grown in certain areas, when we can look out and say, we know that there has been fires and that the weather in Humus or in Nogales or wherever those areas are that we're growing the abundance of this product, when it's not going to happen the right way, that we can shift in the way that we typically handle produce as a whole. I think that the food industry is going to have to follow that. We're going to have to figure out a way that we're not trucking product from one side of the country to the other for a brand or for a purpose, I should say, but rather for a purpose. That when we think about food service distribution, it's really about getting the right products to the right locations. And the only way that we can do that and keep it cost effective, where food doesn't become a hindrance cost to the average American family, let alone the family that it needs a little bit extra or that is short, maybe just even for a month. The only way to do that without having that cost go astronomically high is to continue to work together. And I think that's a little bit of that, food, when we talk about that same type of thing and the way that we move product from one area to the other, that it can't just be single-minded, single company. It really does need to be something that we work on together.
That's wonderful. Brian, I appreciate you sharing that big picture vision for us. You've kind of set the tone for what a lot of the topics that we're going to cover in future episodes, some of those gaps, some of those solutions, highlighting some of those complexities that revolve around food recovery and optimizing the food supply chain. So thank you very much, not only for joining us today, but also for leading the way in all of these areas. So thank you.
Absolutely, Mike. Great to have a chance to see you, and wish you the best on future podcasts.
All right. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye. All right. We're very lucky to have with us today Dr. Robert Levin, who is the Public Health Officer for the County of Ventura. And if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Levin, I think you've been in this position for well over, I believe it's 24 years. Is that correct?
23.
23. Okay. I'm jumping the gun, but I think especially in light of COVID, that record's impressive enough without COVID. But I think I speak for a lot of people in saying thank you for what you do, especially during COVID. And boy, you were in an unenviable position. I know that.
I think all of us were in unenviable positions during these last couple of years.
That's a very good point. All right. Well, we first met several years ago. You heard about our food recovery program from Dr. Eric Handler, the public health officer for Orange County. And immediately you kind of took or gravitated to the notion that we could use excess edible food to alleviate food insecurity. So can you just share for us, what was it that attracted you to that notion?
Well, just on the surface, people shouldn't be hungry. It doesn't feel good, and it has a bad effect on your health. And I think all of our parents taught us that we shouldn't waste food. And very importantly, wasted food contributes to climate change. Conservation of food reduces methane, and this methane is worse than carbon dioxide for climate change. It comes from landfills, and we're putting 34 million pounds of food into landfills every year that doesn't need to go into landfills. Furthermore, by diverting food from the landfill to people, it conserves energy and resources. It prevents pollution that's involved in growing it, harvesting it, packaging it, transporting it to groceries, the sale of it, and how we prepare it in our homes. And then what we throw out, there's more waste in the transport of that, whether it's on a small scale from our home or a large scale from the garbage people that we send it off to, or to large restaurants or anyone else who prepares and gets rid of food at the end.
Yeah, that's exactly. And you touched on something that we always try to explain is there's really two components of this. There's an environmental component of this food becomes organic matter that ends up in the landfill. There's also a health component, meaning the access to this food as a food source is critical in alleviating food insecurity. And there is an overall health a component to this that combines them. But if you don't mind, Dr. Levin, can you kind of explain to us what some of those symptoms are, those chronic symptoms, health symptoms of food insecurity?
Some of the effects of being food insecure, one of them is it translates to anemia, which is really minor compared to some of the other things I'm going to mention. There are cognitive problems, and that's at all levels. But people who go hungry intermittently or are hungry all the time have cognitive problems. And for me, it's most impressive in children, most important in children, because it leads to school problems. And we all know that kids that aren't reading up to grade level by the 5th grade, they spend more time in jail and prison. So it has far-reaching chain of events that it leads to. It causes poor general health. And not only is the health of a person poor, but people who are food deprived are 3 times more likely to not make or not keep their appointments with their doctors.
Wow.
They have more asthma. One of the cognitive problems that they have is depression. And as a result of that, there's an increased rate of suicide among people. Oral health issues, dental. There are just any number of medical chronic problems that can result from a lack of food.
So, Doc, and I always use my mom as an example. When she was well into her late 80s, she had congestive heart failure, and she had a buildup of fluid in her body, and it would manifest itself in the form of open sores on her legs and swollen ankles, feet, and legs. And we determined it's the sodium that was basically the problem. Well, currently, one of the problems we have with the charitable feeding chain is that if there is someone in that condition, a senior, who typically should be on a restricted sodium diet, and they're food insecure, they have a choice. They can either have emergency prepackaged, non-perishable food loaded with sodium, or they go hungry. And it's a horrible decision for a senior to make. But given that, and we saw what happens when we give people like that access to nutritious food based upon their dietary restrictions, as you mentioned, their overall health improves. Is it safe to say that the cost of care ultimately would be reduced if we give people access to nutritious food?
Well, the reason we have statistics that show that there's more anemia in food-deprived groups than in the population where it's not deprived, that there's more learning problems, et cetera, is because we have this control group. And by nourishing people who are currently undernourished, we move them from that comparative group into the control group. So they're like anybody else, and the stress, the relationship to those food problems goes away.
Yeah. So, well, Doc, I just want you to know that in this podcast series, you've helped identify some of the general areas that we're really going to dive deeper into. You've helped us kind of tee up the entire session, so to speak. So I want to thank you for your time today, and just, again, thank you for your leadership in identifying this opportunity to address food insecurity and food waste and really supporting it. And we look forward to talking to you.
All right, and I'm hoping we can get back into this in our county. We missed the boat, but hope springs eternal.
Well, and luckily another boat's coming around again. So we're going to catch the next one.
Very good. Okay, well, thanks. And thanks for doing this work, Mike.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Today we have Nancy Beta, Executive Director of Food Cycle LA, joining us. One of the things we always talk about is the importance of having the nonprofit sector work collaboratively for a greater good. And there is no better partner to us than Nancy Beta. Different organizations come to that realization at different times, but Nancy, you were one of the first to recognize that, a shared mission and vision can be accomplished when we work together. So in the spirit of collaboration and in the efforts that you've provided to us, I wanted to be able to pick your brain and share for people all over kind of how you look at this collaboration. So if you don't mind, if you don't mind, just tell us what that collaboration means to you and the importance of it.
Yes, thank you. So one of the things that I found when I first entered sort of the nonprofit field was that there is a mentality and a kind of fear of sharing resources, because people feel that, that they are, they're worried about funding, they're worried about not having adequate resources for their own organization, so they can be very guarded and very compartmentalized in the way that they're willing to share information. From the beginning, it's been a core value of ours and just a foundational principle that when we all work together, you actually expand and get more resources. So we don't really see, Food Cycle has never seen this kind of scarcity vision, because the truth is we have such an abundance of food in the United States, and the fact that we're wasting, between 30 and 40% of us, that amount, tells us that scarcity isn't a problem. So coming from that, our vision has always been to say, how do we now also bring into the conversation the climate change impact of food recovery? Because in the past, since most food recovery has been done by nonprofits, and there is that kind of competitiveness in some ways in the past, it was really important to change and to see how we can share the things we have to have a greater impact.
It's really ironic that food recovery and this effort has an environmental impact. So in other words, we're keeping food out of landfills, it's not turning into methane gas. But in order to do this, we're putting all these extra trucks and vehicles on the road without any coordination, meaning they're crisscrossing all over a geographic area, burning up resources and, adding to the carbon footprint. So to your point, the collaboration allows us all to be more effective. Then on the flip side of it, if you look at the food industry perspective, it's really important to them that they have system-wide solutions. So collaboration, as you've defined it, helps provide a solution to a retailer, a donor, so that they're able to have the same type of solutions wherever they have a location. In fact, we've been working with one retailer right now to create this consistent form of or program so that wherever their employees go, whatever unit they go in different counties or even in different states, they have this solution that's available. And people don't realize the importance of having the nonprofit sector be connected for that benefit. There's the environmental part of it, then there's this system efficiencies element of it.
Yes, absolutely. And from the perspective of donating businesses, that coordination is crucial, and it's something that that hasn't actually been a priority in the past. So because it was growing, the food recovery system that we have now, it isn't actually much of a system. It's been kind of, where's a group that can go and pick up from this store? Not necessarily matched according to, can this particular group actually use the food they're picking up? We had gotten reports of some of the recovery that we took over in the past. Say there would have been a volunteer group that was picking up there and couldn't use one particular element of what those donations were, like dairy. We had a senior citizens group that was always throwing away all the dairy, whereas we know that we have within our network these families that are desperate for those exact foods that were not being well matched without some kind of logistics and matching coming into the equation.
Right. Now we're going to go into greater detail over the coming weeks and months and exactly how we work, how the system should work, what models are effective. But in essence, we hear this all the time where, well, this model may work in an urban area, or it may work in your county, but it doesn't work here. And in essence, what it is either a nonprofit or the jurisdiction, a government, public sector, really wanting to take control of it or have more input in it. When in the reality, wherever there's food, there's a way of re-engineering it in reverse to get food out of there. And that's where that collaboration is really important. So if you don't mind, kind of touch on the funding element and how collaboration can help us access more sustainable funding.
Yeah, so I think that this is a really key point right now, especially here in California with the implementation of SB 1383, and there has been a shift to most of the funding that will become available in California also has a climate impact piece to it. So it's critical that we look carefully at the existing capacity and that we share capacity. And I think this holds, however, for anywhere in the United States, anywhere globally, actually, that it's important to collect information about capacity and to begin using better the technology we now have. One of the things that's really changed is we now have the technology that can solve some of the issues that have been barriers to having that kind of connectivity and systemic, addressing in a systemic way the issue of food waste. So funding, I think, it can be different on a nonprofit level, but that has been one of the kind of I think the barriers to cooperation in the past, because people did have a feeling that they were fighting for resources and funding as nonprofits. However, in terms of creating regional systems, in terms of revising the system, I think that we actually, when we start to look at it in that way and create networks, we actually open up the doors to having a much, much greater access to additional funding and to more major kinds of funding than we do when we're working alone as a nonprofit. So we're right now working really hard to create a more collaborative network here in the Los Angeles area, and to share with them that this is one of the ways that we can not only get additional funding, because our impact will be so much greater, and funders respond to results and are data driven. So when you can show that you have a successful system, and especially one that can be exported, then you're really opening up the doors to additional funding.
That's wonderful. So again, Nancy, in the weeks and months to come, we're going to call on you again to go into some of these things in greater detail. But I appreciate you spending time with us, sharing with us the importance of collaboration from your perspective. All of us at Abound Food Care really welcome the opportunity to work with you. You have just been a wonderful partner, advocate, and we're creating a movement with your help, and it's going to resonate all over the country because the cost benefits that it provides.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I've felt from the beginning, I've always been inspired and impressed by your willingness to share information, to work together. There's a generosity. Abound fits you very well, because I think that there's a very generous spirit that drives everything you do, and I recognize and I'm very grateful for that. So thank you.
I appreciate that. So with that, I won't send the invoice I had ready for you. But
all right, that's a good trade. Thanks.
Nancy, thanks again. Really appreciate you joining us.
You too. All right, thank you. Bye, Mike.
Bye now.
Thanks for listening to Plentiful, an Abound Food Care podcast. You can find the Plentiful podcast on Anchor, Spotify, Apple, Google, and wherever you find your podcasts. Visit our website, www.aboundfoodcare.org, for more information about Abound Food Care and how to donate and support Abound Food Care. Keep up with us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn.